Good afternoon. This is the Ordinance Committee meeting of June. That would be July 26, 2016. Madam Clerk, would you call the roll, please?
Councilmember Rouse?
Here.
Councilmember Hotchkiss?
Here.
Councilmember Murillo?
Here.
Okay, thank you. We'll accept public comment on any item not on the agenda. Are there any public comment speaker slips? Okay, seeing none, we'll move forward with the agenda. Would you please read the item?
Proposed ordinance amendments to establish historic and special design districts. Recommendation that the Ordinance Committee provide direction to staff regarding proposed criteria to designate historic districts and special design districts, and review and consider provisions for post-disaster alteration, repair, restoration, reconstruction, and demolition of the historic and cultural resources.
Thank you. And Mr. Lamone, are you?
Yes.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Ordinance Committee members. The first thing I wanted to do was to outline today's presentation, to give you a sense of what we're going to be discussing today. I do want to provide you some background information just to get you up to speed and the public up to speed as to where we are in the review process of these proposed ordinance amendments. And then I'm going to focus today on reviewing historic districts and special districts and try to understand the differences between both. The reason we're doing that is because, as you recall, I indicated in our last meeting in June that the Ordinance Committee in 2013 expressed some concerns about why special districts were necessary. And what I would like to do today is walk you through some of the districts that were created in Santa Barbara and also what other communities are doing in order to preserve neighborhoods and to give some compatibility considerations and criteria so development is regulated in certain parts of the cities that they want to preserve. Additionally, we have Nicole Hernandez, our urban historian, who's going to walk you through the eligibility criteria for historic districts. That's another question that you would like. You had indicated that you wanted us to focus in on to make sure that our criteria is consistent with other communities. And she'll walk you through the type of standard criteria that is from the National Register that we're using, as well as some additional factors I think that are important for our local districts. We'd also like in these discussions have you understand what our expected processes and procedures are, and related to that, our staff recommendations on how the existing districts that are currently in place would be proposed to be maintained. There's certainly some concern about some existing districts, and I'll get into that as to why the boundaries were set in the current configuration. And along that way, I'm going to give examples of some of the districts and how they were created. Background information, as you know, the city has a 5-year historic resources work program that was adopted shortly after the historic resources element in December 2012. We had 47 implementation items. The plan was supported by the Historic Landmarks Commission, which reviewed that plan in January of 2013, and it was subsequently adopted by City Council in February. That really initiated the direction, which was to go forward with a prioritization of ordinance amendments. That was a critical key component that our Historic Resources Element Subcommittee asked that we pursue. Unfortunately, those discussions did stop. We did have some additional focus on other items that we worked on in the meantime, but we're glad to have returned back for the third meeting that happened again in June, and where a status update was provided, and we set out a meeting schedule for the remainder of the year going into early next year, where we think we'll have plenty of times to check in with the Historic Landmarks Commission, check in with you on a draft, and have appropriate direction. There are some unresolved issues with respect to the ordinance, but I also wanted to include that we've done a remarkable job in completing or making efforts on the implementation items that were spelled out in the 5-year program. As you can see, we had 8 items that we were setting out to try to accomplish in those 5 years, and for the most part, the first 6 there that you see, we have completed. Historic resource design guidelines have been drafted. It was a tremendous effort on the part of our historian that worked on it over the course of possibly 3 years. The first item I gave her was work on these, And we're very happy that we have a draft that we feel could be submitted to council for adoption. We've recently adapted, flagged, and mapped all our parcels with sensitivity with respect to historic resources. So now all parcels are identified. So if a developer comes into the city, we now can tell them that be careful, we have some historic resources in close proximity. We've done an effort to complete all our survey forms. That has all been in resulting of the creation of an online historic database. I'm happy to report we have that online now, and we're testing it. So it's available for the public. They have access to all this historic resource information. And Nicole continues to work on that refinements to make sure we have a search engine that works for all types of searches. We've increased the number of designations as well as continue to update the potential list. That's a constant thing that we continue to monitor when we discover resources that need to be identified as potentially significant. So today's emphasis is to focus on the direction to create historic districts, implement them with a new ordinance. But one of the parameters that the historic resources elements insisted on is try to find ways to simplify the ordinance as well as provide flexibility and regulation. So we'll be working with our city attorney to try to achieve those. It's not a simple task. There's a lot of information that's currently in our ordinance and that we'd like to introduce, and we're going to try to do our best job to give back to you with a draft that's readable and understandable. The prioritization, again, was to develop hopefully an ordinance that dealt with not only historic districts but special design districts, and I'll walk you through that special design district portion of it to have you understand why we think it's a necessary component. We also have a program in place for using historic existing historic resource survey data that will help us define where these districts are and why there's some specific boundaries that are identified as worthy of district designation. Also, again, our goal is to simplify and better organize the existing municipal code provisions. Currently, it's in one chapter, our Historic Structures Ordinance 2222. And early indications from Mr. Vincent is he would like to reorganize and reformat some of those chapters to make it very clear how we could convey the information that's necessary for the public to understand how we deal with historic resources. So what do we have in the city? We have historic districts and special districts. Here are the listed districts. You'll see that the existing special districts are identified. Lower Riviera Survey Area Special Design District, created around the Bungalow District, potential historic district. Mission Special Design District, Highway 101 Special Design District, Hillside Design District, and of course the Bungalow District, which is part of the Lower Riviera Special Design District. We have existing landmark and historic districts both. One of the things that we're going to be asking you today is whether you agree with staff that there should be some name changes. We feel that the El Pueblo Viejo name and the special should be rather a special design district classification. It works more like that. We also believe that the Brinkerhoff Avenue landmark district is actually a historic district, and so we look forward to making that more clear in our future ordinances. This is a map outlining the special districts and historic districts that exist or are proposed in the future. We're still in the process of studying specific areas. Some of this information has been shared with our designation and survey subcommittee with the Historic Landmarks Commission. But at this point, what we anticipate doing is once we have the basic structure of our ordinance in place, it would be very clear for the public to understand how districts are nominated, created, and eventually adopted by City Council. And ultimately, every district would come forward to City Council one by one. So one of the first questions that we'd like to walk you through is why were special districts created and how are they used or currently used? And I'm grabbed a couple of informations or criteria that were also used in other communities. And some of this criteria is going to be used to develop a definition of a special design district, and I'll walk you through that. There are areas where the city has chosen to protect specific neighborhoods and maintain design conformity. So the stated purpose and goal are outlined in the ordinance. There is a clear connection between creating a special design district and trying to establish design standards beyond what the land use zoning requirements apply to properties. And we've done that through the implementation and use of design guidelines, some development standards, and a review process. And of course, these special design districts have been created with the council approval. So we're still working with our city attorney to try to create a definition that would work in the city of Santa Barbara, that would allow the city to try to protect specific neighborhoods. In most cases, the special design districts have been created for a specific purpose and goal. And what our city attorney has indicated that as we move forward with special design districts formations, it's very important to state a purpose and a goal as part of that creation. So we have a community purpose and a community aspect of purpose to create these districts. We believe that by creating a clear definition, we could understand where they would be applicable and how they could be created. Again, these are the current existing special design district. Now, I'm going to focus on two of them, the Mission Area Special Design District and the Lower Riviera Survey Special Design District, Bungalow District areas. The Lower Riviera Special Design District was created in 2006. It was primarily initiated by the neighborhood. It was an effort to protect the historic bungalows from incompatible development. There had actually been several examples where the Architecture Board of Review had approved Spanish architecture closely in close proximity to those bungalows, and there was a concern that these bungalows would be lost due to development. And City Council agreed with those assertions and directed staff to work on not only creating the special design district, but also completing the survey work that was in the process and developing design guidelines, which were adopted by City Council. This, again, was a byproduct of understanding that we were about embarking into several different survey areas that the city had a contractual arrangement with historians to complete. The Lower Riviera survey was completed, Area 6, as well as the waterfront area survey. Since that time, we've had the ability to also focus in on some downtown areas that have also been surveyed. This is the Lower Riviera survey area. It was a defined boundary. And within that area, the historians that completed the survey identified a special design district area, as well as within that district, a potential bungalow historic district that eventually happened. So what happened is that City Council knew about this area, and so they gave an interim designation and said, we're going to protect this area of the city, created that, and subsequently now, as we move forward, we've identified a much tighter boundary, which gives a higher percentage of contributors to the bungalow district. Here you have a map that identifies that if you were just to look at the purplish-looking properties, they would be the primary bungalows that would be protected in this district. And so if we were to outline the actual boundaries in black there, the resulting contribution rate for contributors would be 82%. So by bringing in the borders, we have more integrity to the district, and that's what most likely will come forward. Now, the question becomes, what happens to the other properties that are outside the district that is identified? There will be additional parcels, because if we have 196 parcels that will not be in the historic district, that means something has to happen if we want to protect that neighborhood. We're suggesting that still remain as a special design district, buffering the historic district. We also have a Mission Area Special Design District. I've roughly given you an example of the type of buffer area that was created around our Santa Barbara Old Mission. Essentially, Part 2 is the light blue area that was part of EPV that was identified around the mission. So that has the review of the Historic Landmarks Commission. But interestingly enough, I think in order to protect the area leading to the mission, another 1,000 feet from the old mission property was created as a special design district. That special design district requires a review by the ABR for alterations that require building permits in those areas. It also eventually triggered single-family design board review for single-family development as the single-family design board was created. There is not much in our current ordinance that explains why that is in place. I think our city attorney is basically saying if you create a special design district, I don't know if Mr. Vincent wants to jump into it, but there's got to be a community interest. And I think the speculation is that we wanted to further protect our old Spanish mission, and that's why it was created. Is that relatively speaking?
Well, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, you do have to have a public purpose in order to put on a historic preservation regulatory structure over the regular property rights. It can be both historic, it can be aesthetic, and so that's what drives a lot of the special design districts. It's the same similar public purposes for any design review, any aesthetic review. The point I would make for the committee as well as the council and anyone who is speaking to these topics is the implementation, as Mr. Lamone just gave an example, the fact that the ordinance specifying the district around the mission fails to clearly identify its purpose. Over time, as employees, as staff members for the city change over, you'll lose that historical and institutional memory, and the future implementation of the district may fail or wane if it's not clear to the next group of employees or the next group of citizens who are trying to interpret the purpose behind the district. So that's the recommendation I have is to start out every district by clearly articulating the purpose behind the district, using that purpose to then inform what design restrictions or what protections are necessary in order to achieve that purpose. And then you'll have clear implementation carrying through, as well as members of the public, as well as property owners who may own properties within that district or who may be considering buying property within that district will also be clear about the community's expectations and what will be required of them as property owners within the district.
Ms. Rio?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Mr. Lamone, I read the report doesn't say when the special design district was created, the red line. How long has it been there?
I suspect 1972. Mary Lou's here in the audience. Maybe she can correct me, but that's what I discovered, approximate in that area.
Okay. I'm sorry. That was the next slide. Okay, I didn't. I'm awake here. I swear. Okay, and what the staff report says is that you're assessing it.
Yes, so. I think it's valid to look at it, to have discussions with our Historic Landmarks Commission and our boards to see exactly what type of guidelines apply to this area. Over the recent course of years, I've had many discussions with architects that have actually implied that there are no guidelines that apply because they're not listed anywhere. And we've had some contemporary homes that have been proposed in those areas that they actually said, well, how can I avoid design review? So we're trying to understand, again, if we have guidelines, we should state the purpose. So I intend to propose some specific rationale for why that district is in place, having discussions with local community members and our boards and commissions and see if we can articulate further purpose so it's not unclear.
So you're developing a community outreach plan then?
Well,
for
I think
professionals and residents?
As we move forward with any type of discussions on districts, I think it's important to have those public meetings, to have that discussion with our boards, to actually explain and identify whether it makes sense to have the current boundaries as they're depicted. There might be support to just leave them in place, and then I would like to know specifically what type of guidelines should apply to these areas. What are we looking for? Historic character, certain architectural styles. I think it's important as we get into this ordinance to clearly define that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Just to go back to Mr. Vincent. Mr. Vincent, so are you saying that each design district will have its own unique statement of purpose and community purpose and definitions so that we will be recreating each one of these for even the established design districts going forward so that the institutional memory, or so to speak, for future staff and councils will be somewhat memorialized?
Mr. Chair, I would say that going forward, certainly any new district should have its purpose articulated clearly. I'll leave it to council to decide whether they want to open up the proverbial can of worms regarding the current districts. Staff, Mr. Lomone has articulated one district that may be ripe for consideration of including some language articulating its purpose. But I think that it just makes sense for a number of reasons to take the time to clearly articulate the purpose of new districts. Not only does it establishes the appropriateness of the purpose, it also will help people identify what should be the scope of the district, what is a contributing or non-contributing element to this, or resource to the district. That will help define the geographical boundaries of the district. It also informs what kinds of regulations and what kinds of design standards would be appropriate to apply to, given the nature of the architectural resource that you're trying to protect. Different architectural styles call out for different kinds of standards. The last part is that once you have all of that in place, I suspect that you will find much stronger public support from the property owners, because you'll find that the Bungalow Haven district is a perfect example where there was an example where you had a strong concentration of contributing resources. People had basically self-selected. The people who buy those Craftsman homes like Craftsman homes, and presumably they like living in a neighborhood that has a high concentration of them. Needless to say, you didn't get very much pushback when it was decided to put that district together. As your concentration of resources diminishes, I suggest that you'll find that you'll have more opposition, because you just won't have the commonality of interest that you have in these higher concentration districts. So that's all I got at this point.
Yeah, thank you.
What I also wanted to give you an example, and I took the liberty of sending you some links to the other communities that are mentioned in the staff report, and just to highlight that it's a common occurrence to identify your historic districts in a community and lay out some protection mechanisms. So we're a little bit behind the curve. I think we've identified our districts, and now we just need to implement them if there's support for them to be done so. I wanted to convey an example of conservation districts that's identified in the city of San Francisco. I wanted to read something to you that said, it's unlike traditional historic districts, which recognize historic and cultural significance, conservation districts seek to designate and protect buildings based on architectural quality and contribution to the environment. So there's concentrations of buildings that create a geographic area of a unique quality and thus facilitate preservation of quality and character of the area as a whole. They even go further and create height and bulk districts where they want to promote the harmony between and visual relationships between the new development and transitions to older buildings. That's sort of what we're dealing with now, where we have new buildings coming in and we have older buildings that are there, and how do we protect and transition to have infill development? And we're going to be looking at that to see where it's appropriate and where it's not appropriate. So as you look at the Mission Area Special Design District, we have 604 parcels. And within those 1,000-foot boundary limits to the mission, we have essentially about 54 on the potential list, with 43 contributors to potential historic districts that are outlined in close to proximity to the Santa Barbara mission. What we're looking at is clearly looking at El Pueblo Viejo Landmark District and identifying whether or not EPV2 around the mission should be looked at to expand its significance and contributors. There's already some interest in what's happening with the Mission Corridor, Canyon Corridor, and so we'll be looking at EPV closely to see what those boundaries look like. I wanted to get into a little bit about El Pueblo Viejo because that district was created in the 60s. There was an intent to protect the historic landmark adobes originally when they were identified as landmarks, as well as El Presidio, which lies at the center core of the city. The boundaries were expanded over time. But what's unusual about this district, it requires mandatory architectural styles for consistency of appearance. And what's happened over the course of years, by expanding the boundaries, we've actually diluted the significance of whether it is really a landmark district. This was, I believe, the original 16 square blocks that were identified as the original landmark district, 313 parcels. And again, the adobes are in the center as well as the Presidio. And over the course of the years, the interest was to try to expand these boundaries to get more architectural review oversight. Currently in that area, we're still investigating it. There's 161 of the 300 buildings are considered historic. We still have some more investigation, but we feel that one day maybe that should be the actual historic district within EPV, that it might be a Presidio historic district or an Adobe historic district. So that's a potential. We're still doing some evaluation of that. El Pueblo Viejo district, if you could look at the current quantity of parcels, we have essentially 61 structures, only 4% are city landmarks, 51 are structures of merits, and 134 are on the potential list. So that translates to 246 out of 1,475, which only is 17%. So is this really a historic district? It might not even be a landmark district, but what we're saying is we still have an underlying goal to maintain the character of the city. So it still can be a district, but it might be better to identify it as a special design district, at least part one. Here you have, again, the original district boundaries, and we're looking at each property to identify the age of construction and what level of significance it is. And over the course of the year, it was interesting how the expanded areas went up to the mission. And there was an increase of protection, desire to protect the center core of the city. And then what we have currently, again, is EPV1 and EPV2. Bregerhof is also unusual because we created a landmark district, but we gave them all structure merit status, not landmark status. We believe it actually is a historic district. It functions as a historic district. All the properties are contributors to the district, and therefore it should be labeled as a historic district. So that brings it back to how do we get to where we want to get, which is to identify the differences between these districts, clearly spell out where special districts would be suggested or proposed, and then identify the difference between why a special district is proposed instead of a historic district. And this is where I'm going to turn it over to Nicole so she can walk you through that criteria.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. I'm just going to walk through some of the criteria that we've researched that we think would be essential to consider in the creation of a historic district. There are important local and nationally recognized historic preservation criteria. At the national level, it is commonplace in California communities as well as across the United States to use the criteria established by the National Register of Historic Places as a base qualifications for designation as a historic district. In general, a historic district is the collection of resources that are historically, architecturally, and culturally significant. It's an ensemble that is worth protecting as a whole, as they tell us about our past as a whole. So they have there's 4 different criteria with the National Register. The first one is that it is associated with significant events of the past. And I think that an example in Santa Barbara would be the Spanish colonization of California, and using that as an event that we would surround a district around. Or it could be associated with lives significant in the history of the city, state, or nation. This might be an example of just architecture associated with Pearl Chase and her revolutionary design ideas to make the city a Spanish and Mediterranean styles after the earthquake in 1925. The third criteria is probably the most often identified from the National Register as it deals with architectural styles and periods of development. Often the districts are limited to architectural styles and types that are represented because they're typically centered around a central theme.
as, for example, in the lower west downtown, we have concentrations of late 19th century Victorian architecture. Or in the West Beach, we have the 1920s Spanish colonial revival architecture. Or in the Bungalow Haven, we have concentrations of craftsman bungalow architecture. And then the period of significance would be the span of time in which those buildings were built. So if you have a late 19th century Victorian district, things that were built after 1900 or whatever date would not really contribute to the district. The fourth National Register criteria is that it would yield information like archaeological information about prehistory. And then we would also consider anything that's already, a district that's already eligible or listed in the state or national registers would certainly qualify for our local criteria. We don't have any national or state districts in our community, but many other communities have. The members outside the community have nominated districts on their own outside to the state or the national register. We would also like to be more specific with our local criteria, and we've looked at other cities. Los Angeles and Sacramento had some really good examples of factors to be considered to further clarify the qualifications for a designated historic district. One would be like a concentration of scenes or themes or sites as they contribute to each other in physical development. And I've seen a couple examples locally. Diana Lane has all the houses designed by Alex D'Alfonso in the same architectural quality. Or on Garden Street, there's the whole Crocker Row of mission-style buildings designed by the same architect. Another criteria would be it exhibits distinct areas of settlement or growth. And I think of West Beach in this area because it was developed when so many hotels were built for the tourist boom that took place in the 1920s through the 1940s. Another distinctive example would be maybe for parks and community planning, like East Cabrillo Parkway would be significant because it was the landscape designed by the Olmsted brothers in 1924. Backed up. Yeah, this is it. So the other criteria would be something we focus on in the surveys would be establishing the integrity. A high percentage of the buildings in the district would need to have high integrity, which is the authenticity of the buildings. We want to make sure there's 7 categories that are established nationally, and it would have to have its original design, its original setting. The streetscape would need to look like it did originally, the materials, workmanship, and so you have this feeling and association when you went into the districts. It's not just important to have a collection of old buildings, but they really need to have enough integrity to convey their original appearance. The resources that have high integrity are deemed contributors to the district, and when resources lack the integrity, they are deemed non-contributing. They're either built outside of the period of significance or have been altered so much they no longer look like they were intended. We recommend that a district have at least 60% of the buildings qualify as contributing. This would be a minimum requirement to ensure our authenticity of our districts, that we really have a place that when you are in there, you have an association and feeling of this is a unique and important place to be. So those are the criteria that we recommend. And I'll pass it back to Jaime now.
Okay, so in summary, what we intend to do is, again, define a purpose and qualification or eligibility criteria as we move forward with either a special design district and historic district. In all cases, we would make a staff recommendation and hopefully have you understand or council understand why we're moving forward in this direction. We'd have set boundaries for the areas in need of protection and clarify that there's a city design review process with associated guidelines. So if you're in the district, you understand clearly what that means. Also, we would identify contributing and non-contributing resources. That's one of the elements that we define as far as what's within the district so people understand the level of alterations and sensitivity of their properties as they exist in the district. So what I thought it would be important to have you understand, and as well as the public, is that district designation has been used as a good neighborhood preservation tool in communities. It improves compatible development. It allows to maintain the smaller scale development in patterns and helps housing affordability, because some of these older houses can stay in their current configuration and be more affordable. What we don't want to do is and sort of, I don't know if you can read that, but it says plastic house number on a pre-1914 gate post. This could destroy the whole neighborhood. That's not our intent, to try to micromanage every property. In fact, as we move forward with Historic District, one of the components, as we will work with our Historic Landmarks Commission, is give the ability for a historian to walk through projects in a manner that may require a Historic Landmarks Commission application. That you could do something administratively, just so the property owner could do the right thing to make sure the character of the district is maintained. At what point does an application require to be submitted for these level of alterations? Now, likewise, there is additional oversight and compliance. So the public perception is, there's more rules. They're imposing more rules on these areas of the cities. And with that, there's increased enforcement in permitting and design guideline enforcement. Unfortunately, there are some folks that will do things without approvals. And you get into this dilemma of, can you approve what they've done already? Ideally, the community is aware of the guidelines in place and the rules, and they wouldn't do work without permit and avoid that type of problem. And obviously, there's additional costs. The more you do, the more oversight we would have. And there are approval steps that are typically associated with historic districts where the historian gets involved. In some cases, the Historic Landmarks Commission would ask for more studies to justify the alteration. And then I also thought it was important that we do intend to come forward to develop some post-disaster references to encourage preservation of damaged cultural resources. What we've learned after the Loma Prieta earthquake, where I think a couple dozen homes or structures were demolished hastily, they were significant landmarks, is that there has to be a protocol in place to either allow for a pause or alternatives to be examined carefully before the building official declares it as a hazard or a structural safety issue. I think there are model ordinances in place that allows for that, to make sure that if a landmark, a quality building is damaged, that there be some shoring in place to make sure it's safe, but that review process take place so that the Historic Landmarks Commission can weigh in on whether this is the appropriate step to go forward to either demolish or, in some cases, repair and reconstruct. And we expect to have components of those provisions in place. And I just wanted to point that out, that rather than extend this meeting today, we thought we would give you sort of a preamble to the next discussion that we intend to have with you to discuss this element of the ordinance. So if you have any questions, we're here to answer questions.
Thank you, Mr. Lamone. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the folks in the audience who happen to make up the exact list of people that I want to have around if I was trying to figure this out in the first place. Any questions from the committee? Ms. Barrio?
In your pros and cons, Mr. Lamone, you didn't mention property values. It seems to me, is that a fair question, whether property values would go up? It's
a fair question. I think Mr. Hernandez has on occasions indicated that designation of structures has a property value increase. We associate that with that. There are different studies that have been cited that there is actually improvement of property values. Some folks identify that as a problem when selling a piece of property, that they don't want a designation on properties because of the concern about additional oversight. So there's both arguments that can be made.
Well, then, I mean, as long as we have a robust public discussion, then everybody knows what the outcome might be. So, thank you.
There are no speaker slips to this. One I was going to ask about it, I asked about it last time, but one of my main concerns are overlaying state recommendations for either density, by right housing, different kinds of mandates that come down. Are our efforts to make a clearly defined and more precise definition of these districts, does that help in any way protect or give us standing when it comes to these kind of things? For example, if the governor's by right housing creation came to pass and they said, well, if somebody wants to build the right kind of density in that district, what do? We have no control. Mr. Vince, do you have an opinion on that?
Well, Mr. Chair, I don't have an opinion, but I do have a comment. The one is that the governor's by right proposal is still kind of in an informational, definitional stage. He outlined broad brush strokes as to what his intentions are. The legislation is yet to be picked up and even moved through. So we don't know what will happen in that particular example. However, there are other examples where similar state mandates or state preemptive statutes have actually carved out exceptions for properties and protected historical resources. One of the protections that is provided within the state density bonus law is actually that if a density bonus project will have a negative effect upon a historic resource, that is grounds for denial of a density bonus project. And while it doesn't carry through every single statute, as you're familiar, they didn't make such a carve out with respect to the statutes facilitating solar installations. So there's not a whole lot of consistency at Sacramento as to protection, but historic resources are in general granted more protection than other types of resources when you're seeing these state preemptive statutes.
But that would also speak to our efforts to try to define it as precisely as possible. Defining the purpose of a historic or special design district can only help. The designation of the design district by itself makes it a historic resource or a cultural resource and brings it into the under that umbrella of historic preservation. So again, I will always encourage the council and the committees to articulate strong purposes for any of these designated districts, but it only helps, it doesn't hurt. Well, thank you for acknowledging the direction from Sacramento is at best confusing. Mr. Hotchkiss.
Quick question. The definition you were just talking about for design district, does it have to be, could it be a blanket definition that would be adapted to any neighborhood that we thought was appropriate, or does it have to be, for instance, in the case of Brinkerhoff, specific to that kind of Victorian design that predominates there?
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, what I would anticipate the ordinance providing is a menu of justifications for districts. In other words, each district would pick from the menu of available protections or the purposes. I think that there was a slide in your PowerPoint presentation that talked about protecting or maintaining architectural consistency. Streetscape preservation. Maybe there's a particular district that had particular historical import on the city where it doesn't necessarily have an architectural consistency, but it has buildings that are reflective of that period of significance. There's an example where you're not going to protect the Victorian buildings if there are no Victorian buildings in that historic district, but you may not even be trying to protect a consistency of appearance. It's as far as architectural design, but you're trying to protect the historical period. There may have been all kinds of different architecture built in that block or that series of blocks, but that for some reason those buildings have remained with appropriate levels of integrity over a historic period of time, that now you look back on it and it tells the community today, that's what it looked like back then. That's what this block looked like when there was some historical significant period to the community. So I'm not anticipating that. Well, I don't expect all of the districts to have the same purpose, and Some of them will be design. I think some of them will have cultural significance. They'll have, as opposed to just simply architectural. I'm anticipating a menu from which the council and members of the community can propose various districts. So that'll guide you. One, is this going to be a special design district, or is this going to be a historical district? Though, depending on what part of the menu the district comes from, will tell you which one to call it. And then once you have identified that purpose, then that will help guide your determinations on the scope of the district, the geographical boundaries, what are contributing resources, what are not contributing resources, etc.
I don't know if this is for you or Mr. Limon. Is approval required by a majority of the people influenced by a designated either design or historic district?
Councilman Hotchkiss, as you recall, we had a summary in our last presentation that I indicated that staff had proposed a no vote requirement for historic districts. In other words, if we feel we've done our analysis and they're historically significant and it has the eligibility criteria, it's really not up to the property owners to require approval or consent. And it's a mixed bag. Some communities require it. We feel it's important, from a planning perspective, to do appropriate CEQA review, is to identify our resources, and if they're eligible, and if council agrees to protect them in that manner, to go ahead and create the district without owner's consent. You could conceivably also have a different standard for a special design district, where sometimes that's more initiated by the property owners. And if the property owners want some level of protection, the slippery slope, which Mr. Vincent has explained to me, is let's say somebody wants to protect private views. Is that an appropriate tool? Is there a government purpose to do that? We would be a little cautious to use that as the right purpose to create that type of district, even if the property owners want it. Also, the size. Can one block create a special design district? Is that something that's supportable? And I think we need to be convinced as planners that it's an appropriate designation, as well as making a case before council as it moves forward if it is in fact supportable.
Does that decision ultimately come to council, or does it remain with staff?
I believe the purpose is to define, as Mr. Vincent, where it's possible, and then we'll have administrative regulations that lays out specific processes of how these are nominated and forwarded through our review boards. Possibly the Historic Landmarks Commission would be involved in those recommendations, and if they agree, we would forward those towards council for initiation if you support that effort.
All right, I just want to be sure there's some forum where if somebody objects, they have opportunity to express that. And I think you've just said there are a number of them.
Yes, I believe that in our procedures we'll develop a noticing process as well as a neighborhood outreach process that involves input, as well as an ability for property owners to come forward and give them their opinions on the matter.
Great, thank you.
Okay, any other questions from committee? Mr. Hotchkiss?
Is it possible to solicit? We have a remarkable collection of people here who have not put slips forward. Ms. Days, would you like to speak? Would you come up, please? Can we do that without a slip, or do we need to have her fill in a...
I'll have her fill in it after.
Okay. Please.
Sorry, I don't think we realized that we had to fill out speaker slips, but I'd like to provide some background and say that Mr. Limon and Mr. Vincent have made some very, very good points. I'd like to, of course, reiterate that Santa Barbara is unique. Our process and all of this is very unique, very early in the state of California and in the whole West. And let's not rush to copy a lot of other big cities and lose our very foundations of why we're doing these kinds of things, and that's where Mr. Vincent's advice about putting very good bases and foundation for each type of district that you create is important. I'd like to point out that some of the existing special design districts that you have are under the purview of the Architectural Board of Review. And then the two landmark districts are under the, and a couple of new historic districts are under the purview of the Historic Landmarks Commission. So I think that kind of thing has to be weighed too about how you want to handle that. The Brinkerhoff district, I worked on that in 1982. We use the term landmark district because that's what El Pueblo Viejo was called. It is more of a classic historic district. Most of them should be landmarks. We were very worried about because it's C2 zoned, at the time we were worried about what might happen close in to jeopardize it. And the property owners were very much in favor of it. They weren't all too unanimous or anxious to go the full landmark designation route, so we settled with structure of merit, which was much easier to do. So I think that is something that the job has pretty much been done for you to convert it to a classic historic district. EPV, I call an architectural control district. The word landmark was put into it because that's what the Advisory Landmark Committee preferred to call it when the ordinance, the Historic Structures Ordinance, was completely rewritten in 1977. I had been named their staff in 1974. They didn't really have a staff before then. Occasionally, the building director would refer some projects that were in El Pueblo Viejo to the ALC, and they would meet. Mr. Sweetser, Attorney Sweetser, kept his own records, thank heavens. But this is something that I've never forgotten. It's a policy of the Architectural Board of Review, dates 1958. And I think it was mostly written by Mr. Bell, who was a very fine man. I remember him. And in it, because remember, the Architectural Board of Review came back into existence, I think, in 1947. So this has a section in it, this policy, Area of Historical Significance. And it names from Chapala Street to Santa Barbara Street, Ortega Street to Mitchell-Torena Street, and Cabrillo Boulevard. So it's interesting that it was prescient. It sort of anticipated the existing EPV in a way. And then it says that portion of all other streets within 300 feet of an existing building of historical significance. And then those shall be designed to complement the architectural character of the neighborhood. And then that talks about the votes necessary by the ABR. So even back then, the ABR was supposed to observe this kind of thing and give special treatment to projects near historic areas. Then around remember the old mission and the Museum of Natural History did not become part of the city until 1968, and that's what kicked in some of the other things about protecting the area. So I sort of remember the city council in around 1969, maybe it was 72, they decided to extend El Pueblo Viejo all the way up to the mission area, and that's why you saw that drawing that Jaime showed. And it was kind of puzzling at the time because it included the Upper East Side, but the intent was really to protect the area around the mission. Then in 76, 77, when we were working on the whole new ordinance, we didn't want to include all of that, the Upper East Side, that immediate area in between. So we created two sections, one of called El Pueblo Viejo Part 2, and then the main Part 1, which was later expanded under the coastal program. But I remember so clearly that there was a provision for 1,000 feet within the old mission, or rather around the old mission. Projects within that area had to go to the Architectural Board of Review, and that was before 1977. And that was supposed to be special treatment by the ABR. I don't know if that still happens, but there's quite a mixed bag of history there, but it all originates with the idea of protecting and controlling the architecture around our several historic areas and we're discovering more all the time. I see nothing wrong with perhaps a narrow mission historic district within El Pueblo Viejo, but you can end up with pretty complicated maps too. But El Pueblo Viejo is in the city charter. It's in the municipal code. It was put in the city charter to protect it from being done away with. So, thank you. Do you have any questions?
Questions?
I have a question for Mr. Lamont.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Days. Appreciate it. Ms. Murillo?
Thank you. So, Mr. Lamont, can Ms. Days seemed to point out there's when ABR looks at things and when HLC does. Can just for me and the public, can you respond to that?
Sure. Councilman Murillo, what I think is important to understand is the city has a different review board based on the location. And what she emphasized was that the Mission Area Special Design District was subject to ABR review for projects in that area. So it was an automatic trigger. If you're in that area, you have to go through the ABR. What happened in about 2007 is when we created the Single Family Design Board, essentially took the single family home development away from the ABR. So we now have two boards reviewing projects in that area. We still have design review, but what I was questioning is just the incomplete nature of when the district was applied. As opposed to the Lower Riviera, there was careful consideration when that special design district was created. We came here, explained to council why we were doing it. There's a half a page of purpose and intent and guidelines associated with that district, and people can trace the history, as Mr. Vincent says, to why it was created. Right now, as we get changeover of staff, when we have new board members, I think some insight as to that protection of 300 feet from a historic structure is lost, or what type of architectural styles are appropriate around the mission. We would like to clarify that as part of this effort, and I think we have an ability to do so now.
So that's part of the assessment related to the special district around the mission?
It only makes sense as we look at each chapter to explain specifically why it's there and whether it should be in a specific chapter related to the historic landmarks purview or the ABR chapter. And we're going to carefully look at each chapter and make sure it all is simple and easy to understand, hopefully.
Very good. Well, I'm ready to move this forward. I appreciate the
Madam,
definitions that you've given. You don't need a
well, actually, I would like to show you on the last slide.
The part about the disaster.
Well, yeah. What I was basically asking Ordinance Committee to confirm is: do you agree that the criteria as developed, we can move forward and include that in our draft ordinance? That was one of the questions that the Ordinance Committee had. What criteria are you using and on what basis? I think we've explained that today, that we are trying to use some consistent criteria. We have expanded, including some additional criteria that we're proposing. We think it's going to deal with the questions that have come up through our some of the correspondence that was sent about thematic or cultural landscapes. We think it's flexible enough to use for that. Our historian believes it can be used for that purpose. So we think we're addressing it in a very extensive manner so we can include that criteria and you serve a basis for developing districts if we have those types of areas in the city. Secondly, do you agree that we need further discussion on the post-disaster provisions? We could draft them consistent with model ordinances and return with that draft, or would you like to speak on that? We're suggesting maybe we should have a short discussion, even though that was not laid out as a discussion item for a future Ordinance Committee meeting.
Well, Mr. Malone, before we get, what is our schedule of these meetings prior to going to council with a full request?
I believe we had one more. We were going to check in with Historic Landmarks Commission also.
We have at least one more bite at the apple at this subject before we go to council for adoption.
We were stopping in with the Historic Landmarks Commission with the making sure that they had opportunity to
just want to make sure that these folks know exactly where, what their opportunity for input is. And as I saw, well, actually, Ms. Maria, did you want to make a motion? Is that, were you in the middle of that?
I was, except I did see another speaker stand up. You didn't. I'm not sure when the public comment period is going to end, but yeah.
Well, think Mr. Hodge kind of started that one up with Ms. Days. Do you want to speak, Mr. Sweeney? We're getting a little tight on time, but I'll give you a big bad 2 minutes if you'd like to do that.
I just want to encourage you. I'm wearing two hats, president of the Upper East Association and chair of the Single Family Design Board. And so we've had circumstances under the Single Family Design Board on the Upper East where certain elements have been reviewed by HLC. So, for instance, a stone wall, but the actual home has been reviewed by the ABR. So sometimes that gets very confusing both to the Single Family Design Board, but also to the applicant, because now they fall under two reviews. So my sense is, as the Upper East president, our members are confused by the current red line, even though it came in 1972. So I would encourage you to move in the direction as recommended by Mr. Vincent to perhaps revisit to make sure that designation is really clearly understood and why is it there and what is its purpose, so that everybody kind of carries that institutional memory forward. Thank you.
Mr. Hodges? Oh, okay, never mind. Okay, very good. Well, I think I agree with Mr. Sweeney that all the clarity we can get, especially to applicants as not only the stakeholders, is going to be the purpose of this going forward. So, do I have a motion to move this forward or give the staff the direction to?
Did we answer your questions, Mr. Limon, about direction?
My indication from the questioning is you're not disputing some of the criteria that we developed, so we're going to move forward with that as to be included in the initial draft ordinance. We might refine it somewhat, but essentially it's there, and that you're agreeing that we should include some post-disaster information in our ordinance to deal with that potential eventuality. But I'm not too sure if you need a discussion on that issue.
I think we do.
Would you like that?
Yes.
Okay.
Sir. So that's part of the motion then.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, moved and seconded.
Mr. Chair, can I speak to the motion?
Present.
One of the few specific points that Mr. Limon made today was a suggestion that there be a minimum percentage of contributing resources within any potential district. Staff has recommended 60% as a starting point. I want to reiterate that you are the ordinance committee. Ultimately, it'll be a majority of the city council that will decide any of these specific points. But unless the committee has a different direction, we would be going forward with that 60% as a starting point of the conversation.
I was comfortable with the 60% mark.
And that will also be a part of the bullet points going forward, or a final recommendation to council from this committee, will it not?
Yes. I mean, what we're doing right now is you're serving as a sounding board.
Right.
We're going to be drafting the ordinance. We'll share that draft ordinance with the HLC to solicit their comments, and then we'll be coming back to you again, and you'll have another bite at the apple at that point.
Very good. So does everybody understand the motion? Do you have a question first? Go ahead, Mr. Hodges.
I do. Is it possible to make use of, as background and helpful input, some of the experts that we really have in the audience here? Can you make that part of your process of deliberation and further refinement?
That's always possible, Mr. Hotchkiss, and often we turn to the public if they can give us some insight. I think this is a step forward. I'll certainly hear from it if we're on the wrong track. There's always an ability to have discussions with our Historic Landmarks Commission subcommittees if they so choose.
Right.
So we'll check in, and if they would like to have members contribute, I'm certainly open to that.
Yeah, I would ask you and the audience to continue to be participants, please. Ready to vote, sir.
Okay, very good. I think we can count on their not being silent about this. Okay, all in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed? No. That carries unanimously. Thank you very much, and thanks once again to the audience for participating. We are adjourned.